Video games and cinema seemingly go hand in hand, at least when being discussed online. A lot of similar techniques are necessary for both. The positioning and moving of the camera, music, 3D modeling, editing, these features are only possible in cinema or video games. But some people conflate these similarities as them being the same art form, or at least incredibly similar. For example, the idea of interactive films like Netflix's Bandersnatch, when an interactive film is basically just a glorified FMV game. My thoughts on the distinction between games and cinema were brought up by the semi-recently released Ghost of Tsushima. I would like to discuss topics other than video games, and at some point I'm going to, but something about Ghost of Tsushima really struck me. Maybe because it was a Sony first-party exclusive by Sucker Punch, a studio who usually makes pretty decent work. I wanted to play it just because I wanted a new open world game to chew through, like most of their other games. And there's like a weird part of me that's very interested in completing checklists, which their games are also very good for. But in that regard, Ghost of Tsushima is a good game. The combat has some challenge to it, it looks really good, the photo mode is spectacular and has so many options, and it really does nail being a decently sized checklist to just run through. With all that said, while playing through it though, I did consistently have one big issue. That being with the story and the aesthetics of the game, and how they are so influenced by prestige samurai cinema like the works of Akira Kurosawa, but for seemingly no reason. The game is not subtle about this, with references to his work, a similar visual style, and most prominently in the way that the game was marketed. During the first full exploration of the game's gameplay and systems, the presentation ended with a discussion of the black and white Kurosawa mode. And when starting the game, the player is given strange choices in the language settings, which the player can choose between standard, samurai cinema, which is just Japanese language, and then Kurosawa mode, to have the game have a black and white filter and a film grain effect over all of the visuals, and a strange filter over the Japanese audio to make it sound tinnier. I know what they're going for, but it does feel somewhat at odds with the tone of the story to have something so fanboy-y right at the start. It's obviously to show their love and respect for a genre of film, but the techniques used throughout and these options make it feel like they were trying to create a larger experience other than just a fun open world to walk around and have fun in. And in that way, the game fails. But that got me thinking about games in general, and how a lot of larger studio games try to replicate cinema. And what does that actually achieve? So first off, are video games cinema? No. And not in an elitist way in which only high art can be cinema. If you want to know my feelings on that, Kyle Kalgren has a great video about why Vine is cinema, so go check that out. Video games and cinema are often conflated because, like all of the visual mediums, they share an artistic language. The main difference between video games and film is the nature of interactivity. The designer's choices in what the player can and can't do, and the nature of their interactions and how those interactions tell a story is inherently part of video games and can't be part of any other medium. Video games started having no real plot and were basically just a way of exploring different types of challenges. You have a vague objective and fun gameplay, and that was really all the games had to offer. In this time, games were about amorphous blobs or strange objects interacting with each other, like a yellow ball eating ghosts and fruit. As graphics progressed, video games became more about characters. With the advent of CDs, having full intros and cinematics became far easier, so most companies started using those to help tell their stories. The strange effect of the change towards film-like stories in games is now that games have two stories. The narrative, the actual events of the plot, like cutscenes, writing, and the ludo narrative, the story the game tells you through how you interact with it. So what is the story of Ghost of Tsushima? Well, the actual plot centers around the Mongol invasion of Tsushima in 1274, and how that affects the lead character Jin Sakai, nephew of the ruler of Tsushima, Lord Shimura. Lots of things happen and like there's twists and other characters, but that's the basic cinematic style plot. And I don't think it really works for the full runtime of the game. There are strong moments, but it feels so based in established tropes and has very little subtext or interesting ideas of its own. The main subtext of the game is a Mulan-esque critique of Asian systems of honour and class, which could have been done well, as it is in a lot of Kurosawa films, but the game seems more interested in the idea of sneakily killing dudes being way better than fighting honourably, which if this is the biggest critique the game has, then that's pretty disappointing. I personally feel like there's more to say in the notion of class superiority within the samurai, the poverty and horrific conditions of the peasants of Japan during this time, especially compared to samurai, how samurai were easily corrupted, and as a system of government it was built for betrayal and legacy over effectively ruling and long-lasting governments, which are all things that Kurosawa has made commentary on. It glosses over a few of these themes, mostly in throwaway dialogue or for the basis of side quests, but never really does much to actually interrogate them. However, to me personally, this isn't the biggest problem, because the gameplay is stellar. When I talk about Tsushima to people, I don't mention the plot or the characters, because so much of it is just whatever. But what I do mention is how great it feels to decide the best way to make it through a camp, or how I had to ride around on my horse for hours to get all of the collectibles, or how the game facilitates really different, interesting approaches to stealth, and how there's so many different pieces of equipment that you can get, or all of the weird glitches I encountered. Because to me, that's what's memorable about the game. So why didn't the story connect? I think it's something to do with ludonarrative dissonance. As mentioned before, the ludonarrative of a game is the story conveyed through gameplay and systems, which is something only a game can do. For example, the narrative of Resident Evil 1 is that stars have been sent in to investigate a missing unit. The ludonarrative is one of powerlessness and fear, which is created through scarce resources, low health, and the inability to effectively deal with your enemies. Ludonarrative dissonance is when the actual features of the game, the gameplay elements, directly contradict the experiences conveyed through the story or style of the game. This is most common in cinematic games, like Naughty Dog's Uncharted and the Last of Us series. To me, though, those are two very different types of dissonance. In Uncharted, the problem is that the lovable, goofball hero who quips and acts like an action movie character in most of the cutscenes horrifically murders people throughout every single game. This dissonance is because the gameplay of games doesn't work well with the types of cinema it is replicating. In, for example, all of the Indiana Jones films, Indy kills maybe like 60 people throughout the entire franchise, which is joked about in the comments of this Indy kill count video as being far too many for an actual schoolteacher, but is literally nothing compared to Nathan Drake, who kills maybe thousands of people across every single game. That's because not only does Uncharted have a longer runtime than just a basic film, but it's an action game, so you have to face more enemies to keep the player invested rather than just watching a hero go through certain actions. The Last of Us has a different problem, that being that the gameplay doesn't really have too much of an effect on the story. The main critique of the first game from many people is that they felt it was just a movie cut up with gameplay spliced in between the scenes, which is kind of true, to be honest. For me, the problem with Tsushima's story is a little bit of both. I feel as though the cutscenes paint you in a very certain light that I, the player, don't ever really experience in combat, and that the actual storytelling isn't really done through the gameplay at all. The gameplay and storytelling feel at odds, especially when I can do most of the game as honourably as possible, but still get berated by my uncle. The game gives you a choice in how to play, which means its story is hampered if you choose to play a certain way that the game doesn't fully account for. Which of course I did because the samurai combat is way cooler. The open world nature of the game also hampers a lot of the side stories and character beats. There are numbered quests so you know nothing will happen to these characters through any of the story beats, because the player has to be able to go back and finish off these characters' quests, so they can't die at any point. And some characters never even had quests, which made me question their fates, and then the 3 named characters who have no quests at all, let's just say their fates justify their lack of quests. It's too well telegraphed to ever get invested in. So why adopt the aesthetics of cinema? Well, that's the interesting question. I mean, obviously these guys must have some respect for all samurai movies, but it does feel strange in this story, as their main influence, Kurosawa, didn't really talk about the external forces on Japan like the Mongols, and a lot of his stories were about the nature of greed or status or living with one's mistakes. They're usually pretty long and verbose, and most of them discuss a lot of themes. An influence I expected a little bit more from was the action-based samurai films like Lone Wolf and Cub, especially in the action. But any influence of films like that is minimal. No sparing blood fountains here. This game seems to focus more on the nature of war against an unknown and scary force, which once again is like Mulan. And even though Mulan is the same kind of xenophobic towards Mongols, I think Mulan works better because it's a story about an actual character's development and their own reasons for wanting to do this. Whereas Jin just feels like he just is doing it because that's what he's supposed to do. There's no real depth to his character. But the main relation the game is going for is to Kurosawa, which seems more like an aesthetic choice than a thematic one. Also, it's a minor gripe, but I hate that the black and white option is called Kurosawa mode. I know it's signed off by the estate of Kurosawa because that's extra advertising for them, but Kurosawa didn't just make black and white films. Which these guys must know, because if the game's art direction takes influence from any Kurosawa film, it's Ran. But also he didn't just make samurai films. Ikaru is a masterpiece, High and Low is one of the most celebrated works in history, and Dreams is just amazing. It feels weird to limit a filmmaker, especially one of his magnitude, to the black and white samurai guy. The other problem is that the black and white doesn't really gel with the game's mechanics exceptionally well. It's implemented into a game that's main combat loop is about color-coordinated attacks. Multiple quests ask for specific colored flowers or markers, and it ruins the beautiful visual style of the game. Also, customization becomes a game of which do you like more, light or dark ropes. But the wind and weather does look really good in black and white, and certain elements like stealth feel easier. So I don't think it was an entirely last-minute decision, but more of an issue of not enough time was put into its implementation. But to answer the question of why the cinematic aesthetics are adopted in most games, I think it's to add dramatic weight. Quite a few Sony first parties, and let's be honest, quite a lot of AAA games more recently, adopt these aesthetics to try and co-opt the language of cinema to make games seem more like art than every other game. Some just in the structure and narrative elements like The Last of Us, or some in the types of camera technique like God of War. I'm not saying any of this is inherently bad, but more that it's inherently dishonest to the nature of games as an art form. Games are a medium unto themselves, but too many games try to be cinema or cinematic, when video games inherently tell their stories in a completely different way. I think a lot of games with these cinematic narratives can be good games, or at least good stories, but the examples of bad or boring narratives that are overindulgent in cinematic flair is ever increasing, and Ghost of Tsushima is just the newest addition to that list. So the final question, does that mean Ghost of Tsushima is a bad game? No. Well, good or bad is subjective, but even with all of my problems with the aesthetics and story of the game is so much more than that. It's got great combat, a lusciously developed world, a great sense of progression, clear goals, well-designed encounters, and some decent story moments. As a game, it works incredibly well. All of the gameplay elements are the reason you'd want to stick with it, And I love checklists and collectibles, which I've made incredibly clear in this video, so it really fulfills that element. It's a solid game, because games aren't built from plot in a traditional sense. They are built from the story you create with your worlds, and the types of fun you can have with the gameplay, and I have a lot of fun stories from the gameplay in Tsushima. So that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it, and this will be the last video game based video for a while, because I really need to try talking about other things. If you have any suggestions for the videos I should be making, leave them below. And if you like this video, think about leaving a like or subscribing so you can show me that you actually care about any of this. Thank you very much and stay safe.